Never Mind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols was released in 1977 and is the band's first and only studio album. It was an undeniable moment in the punk movement and perhaps its most influential release. The band's nucleus of John Lydon, Steve Jones, Paul Cook and Glenn Matlock began writing the album's material back in 1975. Their first gig was arranged by Matlock at St Martin's School of Art in November of that year. Although at the time, they didn't really have much in the way of original material, so relied on a few of their favourite covers in order to get a set together. These included The Who's Substitute, The Small Faces' What You Gonna Do About It, and The Monkees' I'm Not Your Stepping Stone. They continued to play around the London college scene and managed to gain a following of devotees that included Susie Sue and Billy Idol. With Malcolm McLaren on board, guiding their distinctive look and overall punk manifesto, the band started to gain much wider interest by playing bigger venues in London like the Marquee and the 100 Club. They also played further afield, most notably at the Lesser Free Trade Hall in Manchester, which pretty much ignited a whole new music scene there. In attendance were Morrissey, Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook of Joy Division and New Order, and Marquis Smith. It was during a return Manchester gig on the 20th of July that the Pistols premiered a new song, Anarchy in the UK. This was developed and became one of the first songs to be demoed in the sessions with Chris Spedding at Majestic Studios. Chris was immediately impressed with them and spread the word. Incidentally, Spedding had performed as a Womble, a British kids' TV favourite at the time.
I like Chris Spedding, I think he's a good guitar player. But he was a Womble. Must have been hot under them suits.
The song would be perfected at Wessex Sound with producer Dave Goodman initially taking the sessions, followed by the duo of Chris Thomas and Bill Price, who would later go on to produce the full album. Brought in for their ability to create hit records, their first mission was to get Anarchy in the UK ready as their first release on EMI Records. The release of Anarchy saw the Pistols on TV to promote it. This included their notorious appearance on The Bill Grundy Show, where the band drunkenly swore at the presenter before the watershed, prompting outrage from the press. The tour that was planned to promote the record suffered though, with many venues cancelling following the press backlash. This then ultimately led to pressure on EMI to cancel their contract with the band. With the single only out for 2 weeks, EMI ditched the band and paid them off to the tune of £40,000. Not a bad sum of money, but things look pretty bleak at this stage. To further complicate things, in February 1977, McLaren announced that Matlock was leaving the band due to musical differences. Although Matlock says he left voluntarily, Jones claimed in an interview that he was sacked because he liked the Beatles and kept trying to show him Beatles chords. In 2005, Jones admitted that although Matlock was a good songwriter, he didn't look like a Sex Pistol. Many reasons have floated about over the years, with Steve Jones adding,
He was always washing his feet.
bizarrely, Matlock was invited to play bass as a session musician for the album. He said he would if he was paid up front. McLaren refused, and that was the end of his involvement with the record. He was replaced by Rotten's friend Sid Vicious, who had previously drummed for fellow punk acts Susie and the Banshees and the Flowers of Romance. Chris Price said, I remember the first time Sid came down to the studio. We had something set up, and he went over to the board, moved all the faders and said, is this where the music comes out? Even the band sort of went, what? That was a thing, you almost had to tolerate him. The album proper was recorded in the spring and summer of 1977, with Sid mostly out of action in hospital, but doesn't actually play on the record, with Steve Jones filling in on bass, after recording the basic backing tracks of drums and guitar. Despite being ejected by EMI, other record labels were still interested, with A&M grabbing the chance to sign the band with a staged photo shoot outside Buckingham Palace. Although life with the band proved to be far more than they bargained for, as they released them after only 10 days with yet another payoff. Virgin Records swooped in to sign the band and save their career, with God Save the Queen becoming their first single release on Virgin. The release coincided with the Queen's Jubilee, and once again saw the band hit the headlines, with their promotional campaign on the Thames ending in their arrest. The single was banned from any airplay and airbrushed from the charts itself, and there was no way they could be allowed to be at the #1 spot that week. Impressed with the vibe of the Pistols' gigs, Chris Thomas asked Bill Price to make the drums sound like dustbins being kicked downstairs. I think what he meant was to give them some space and attack in the mix. To do this, he had the kit placed in the middle of the recording space, whilst isolating the rest of the band. This helped to give the drums a more reverberant sound on the record. The mics used for the drums were the AKG D12 on the kick with a Neumann KM86 on top of the snare and a Shaw SM57 underneath. Neumann U67s were used for the toms, with Neumann KM84s for overheads. According to Bill Price, there were also a couple of BBC ribbons at floor level behind the drums, to try to pick up the ambience of the bass drum and the bottom skins of the toms. The close mics were then gated to emphasise the attack. Despite their rough and ready image, the recordings and the musical arrangements are actually very well thought out and executed. The overall sound manages to walk the fine line between not sounding too polished whilst having clarity and power. The image of punk being played by kids with cheap guitars with half the strings missing was a million miles from the reality of the professionalism applied by Paul Cook and Steve Jones, with Jones professing that for him, recording the album was the best part of being in the Pistols, as he enjoyed the process of meticulously layering his guitars. He said, "It was all recorded with a Fender Twin as far as I remember. It was a special Twin that had Gauss speakers in, so it made it very MIDI and not so trebly. I had a couple of Gibson Les Pauls as well. There was a black 54 style 70s reissue Les Paul Custom and my white 1974 Les Paul. To my ears, you can hear the difference in the two guitars on the album. The white Les Paul Custom with humbuckers features on most of the tracks, but you can hear a difference in tone from the black Custom with the P90s in the bridge. Bodies is my favourite tone on the album. It has that snarly, throaty P90 roar, different from those humbuckers. I only ever used one effects pedal, and it was on Anarchy in the UK. This was an MXR Phase 45. That was the only thing I added at my end. The Twin was mic'd up with a KM84 and an SM57, placed about 6 inches in front of the speakers, with Chris using the technique of using headphones and moving the mics around to find the right phase correlation to create the desired tone. Glenn Matlock played on Anarchy before leaving, but everything else was Steve Jones, as Sid Vicious was mostly out of action ill in hospital. Glenn favoured the Fender Bassman, with Steve using the setup Sid would use live, which is the Fender Precision into an Ampeg SVT. The cabs were mic'd up with a Neumann U87 pointing at the centre of the speakers. Johnny Rotten used the Shaw SM58 for the guide vocals and stood facing the band, with his back to the open doors of a booth that was in the near right corner of the studio, Chris Thomas said. When it came to the vocal overdubs, we had a beautiful pair of tube U47s at Wessex, but when I put one in front of Johnny for his overdubs, it sounded awful and died after about 30 seconds of being gobbed on. Due to him using his middle register as loud as he could, I wasn't going to get him over the top of all those thrashing guitar parts with a beautiful tube mic that overloaded and didn't sound particularly pleasant when it came out the other end. I put him back on the SM58 and thereafter always used that. It tended to bring out a lot more in his voice, and even if it remained on the stand, it was quite okay when he wanted to grab it. Within any one session, Johnny would do no more than 3 to 6 passes, and I would normally comp these. We certainly didn't do long vocal sessions, and if, after half a dozen passes, the results still weren't convincing, we'd probably return to the song another day. The album was finally released in October 1977, with Virgin boss Richard Branson first having to defend the album's title in court. Despite a ban by some major retailers, the album sold well through independent stores, with advanced orders of 125,000 copies. The number of artists inspired by the band's only album is long, including giants such as Oasis and Nirvana, with Kurt putting the record among his all-time favourites, with the title even inspiring Nirvana's own Nevermind. Noel Gallagher said, "I made 10 albums, and in my mind, they don't match up to that. I'm an arrogant bastard. I'd give them all up to have written that, I truly would." Of course, they never went on to build on their initial success, and imploded on their subsequent US tour. They limped on after Rotten's departure, with Sid fronting their cover of My Way, complete with orchestra. But Sid's death, following an overdose a year later, would finally close the chapter on a brief but significant part in the story of rock and roll.